Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Bree Hogue and I am the sales manager at Powell City of Books here in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. Tonight, we're honored to welcome Carlos Fonseca in conversation with Megan McDowell. You can support Carlos Fonseca and Powell's by purchasing a copy of Natural History. We put a link of that in the chat function tonight, as well as sending you a link in your registration for this event. The event tonight will also include a discussion and a question and answer. If you'd like to ask a question of Carlos or Megan, please add that in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Natural History is a story of art, politics, and hidden realities. Just before the dawn of the new millennium, a curator at a New Jersey Museum of Natural History receives an unusual invitation from a celebrated fashion designer. She proposes they collaborate on an exhibition, the form of which remains largely obscure, even as they enter into a strange relationship marked by evasion and elision. The book received starred reviews in both Publishers Weekly and Kirkus Review, with Publishers Weekly saying, Carlos Fonseca's inventive, complex tale reads like a literary onion, constantly revealing new narratives and layers of meaning. Carlos Fonseca was born in Costa Rica and grew up in Puerto Rico. He studied at Stanford and Princeton and now teaches Latin American literature and culture at Trinity College, Cambridge. In 2016, he was named one of the 20 best Latin American writers born in the 1980s at the Guadalajara Book Fair. And in 2017, he was included in the Bogota 39 list of the best Latin American writers under 40. He's the author of the novel Colonel Lágrimas, and in 2018, he won a national prize for literature in Costa Rica for his book of essays, La Lucidez del Miope. Tonight, Fonseca is joined in conversation by Megan McDowell. Megan is an award-winning Spanish language literary translator. In addition to Natural History and other books, Megan also translated the new book, My Favorite Girlfriend Was a French Bulldog by Lena Rodriguez Iglesias. Her translations have been published in the New Yorker, Tin House, and the Paris Review, among others. Her translations have won the Vallée-Inclán Prize and the English Pen Prize and been short and long listed for the Man Booker Prize. She lives in Santiago, Chile. Carlos and Megan, thank you so much for joining us this evening to talk about natural history.
Thank you so much for having us. And I think we should give a special thank you to Carlos because he's joining us from London, where it's 1 in the morning. I think to get started, we'll just give a quick description of the book that we are here to talk about. And I wanted to start out with giving a reading, a short reading of the book, and then Carlos and I are going to kind of interview each other and ask each other some questions. And then we'll open it up in the last 20 minutes or so for questions from listeners, watchers, viewers. So does that sound good, Carlos?
Yeah, that sounds lovely. Okay. So who should begin? Should you begin or should I begin with the first reading?
Well, let's give a description of the book, which is by no means an easy thing to do. Like, I think it's always really difficult to sum up any novel in a few words, but this is a really particularly difficult novel to summarize. In general terms, it's a philosophical novel of ideas. It's a novel about art and art theory, and it's a novel in which language is of primary importance. It centers on themes like, I guess, mimicry, camouflage. It's a book about belief and nihilism and the conflict of generations. I guess the best way to summarize it is by saying that it's a puzzle novel, that it puts the pieces of a puzzle out there for the reader to put together. to talk in specific terms about plot, we could say that it centers on one family, right? There's Giovanna, who is a fashion designer, her mother, Virginia, who was a model, then becomes an artist, and her father, an Israeli photographer. And there's the main character who is kind of the witness of the story throughout the 5 sections of the book. But within all those sections, there are many different voices and many different kind of stories within stories. But the story of that family is the one that the book kind of centers around. Did you want to add anything to that? Did I forget anything?
No, I think, like, you know, as you said, like you said it much nicely than me. Like, I think it's the story of a family at the very end of the day. And it's a story of a family that, like, one day decides to take a trip in, like, Latin America, like looking for an anarchist jungle where they seem to, like, believe at least that they will find some sort of, like, you know, peace or revelation. But once they get there, each of the family members finds something different. And the novel, in one way or another, deals with the aftermath of that event, which takes place in, like, the Central American jungle in 1978. And each of the characters gets one of the sections and tries to retrospectively understand via different ways, through photography, through conceptual art, through fashion design, what was implied or what happened then. And I think, like, both Megan and me, we will read 2 different excerpts of the novel, both of them actually written by the mother of the family, Virginia McAllister, that address in different ways some of the themes that, like, Megan mentioned, like animal mimesis, camouflage, identity. What would it mean to think of identity in camouflage terms as something that is acquired or always related to the other or others, right? So we thought that, like, it might be, like, interesting for you guys to, if we began just very briefly, you know, reading the very beginning of those excerpts in Spanish and then continuing in English. So I'll begin with a very brief excerpt in which Virginia McAllister, the mother, who is involved in some sort of, like, legal troubles related to this artistic project that he has that has brought her on trial or to trial, is already imprisoned and, like, begins to reflect upon her younger years as an actress, right? And the type of experience she had when people were photographing her or filming her. And I'll just very briefly read 2 of the first sentences in Spanish, just for you guys to, like, get, like, a kind of, like, a rhythm of how it would sound in Spanish and then how it sounds in Megan's great translation. So I'll begin just reading. Hoy, desde mi pequeña ventana, he visto una banda de pájaros dividir el pulcro azul del cielo, y en su inapresable silueta he creído ver una imagen de mi propia libertad. Eran tantos, todos idénticos en su azabache anónimo, y yo por un instante creí ver en sus juegos aéreos el esbozo de una posible fuga. So that's the Spanish, and now I'll go on to, like, read the full-on excerpt of the letter that she sends to his lawyer in English, in Megan's translation. And it goes like this. Today, out of my tiny window, I saw a flock of birds caught through the faultless blue of the sky, and in their inaccessible shapes, I thought I saw an image of my own freedom. There were so many of them, all identical in their anonymous jet black, and for a second I thought I saw a possible escape in their aerial games. Then I remember those years I spent in front of the camera lenses, those days when they all looked at me and I was an image that everybody but me could see. For just an instant, I again felt that strange sensation of being pure image. I can't lie. I must admit that sometimes I like the freedom of being surface without essence. But then, in the gaps of silence that yawned between the moments of filming, I understood that they, the man, the cameras, the screen, they all thought they possessed me. They believed the rectangles held me prisoner. It was a sad realization, but today I saw the flock of birds break the tedium of the blue afternoon, and I laughed, thinking how those people didn't know I never felt as free as in the moments when, though only for a second, I managed to become pure image, just a mask, a being capable of constantly shifting form, changing personalities like names. And then, when I heard the sound of the now distant birds, when I heard their warble reaching me from somewhere else, someplace outside my field of vision that belonged to fantasy and desire, I thought of Joab. I remember the photographs Joab took of me as a teenager. Joab, who in a way had been the only one to really see me, the only one who saw me beyond the frame of the photos printed in the magazines. And I couldn't help but remember the picture he took of me that day in the middle of the jungle. I saw him as he pressed the shutter, and I recognized what I felt that afternoon. The sad sensation that his eyes too held something of prison and punishment. I imagine him months later developing those photographs where he would ultimately see me as everyone had seen me until then, within the rectangle of the photographic frame. And I told myself it didn't matter, that I had to be brave. I had to return to the original intuition I had had when I was young, when in front of the cameras that tried to imprison me, I understood that any photograph was a mere copy, a copy of a copy, and that I, like that image, was free to run and to reproduce without any feeling of guilt. Free to reproduce the way frogs do in ponds, their tadpoles all identical yet different. Free to be at the same time that women whose face you have depicted, and to be nevertheless eternally another, the woman I had always wanted to be, the same one who now was returning to her ambition. And I understood that, though everybody thought it was foolish, my responsibility was to pursue that intuition that had brought me to the jungle until I reached an end. I thought about things like that until the sound of the birds was lost in the afternoon silence, and there was nothing for me to do but sit down and write to you this letter. So that's the fragment that I had, and that's Megan's translation. So now, Megan, you can read this one.
So I'm going to read another short fragment, which is also in the voice of Viviana Luxemburg, aka Virginia McAllister. We can talk about that later. She's probably my favorite character in the book, and also one of the most mysterious, because we learn a lot about her, but these are kind of the only sections of the book where we actually hear her voice, and they're some of my favorite parts. So I'm going to do the same thing, read the first couple lines in Spanish and then switch to English. I'm sorry that I'm not looking straight into the camera. I'm on an iPad and it's a little haphazard. So, quisiera escribir estas líneas en código, en un idioma privado que solamente entendiéramos ella y yo, mi hija y yo. ¿O no se reduce a eso la vida? Una larga estela de eventos sin forma que culmina el día que alguien traza un garabato en la arena y solo dos personas creen entender la clave que ahí se esposa. I forgot to mention this is from the Great South. I wish I could write these lines in a secret code, in a private language that only she and I would understand, my daughter and I. After all, isn't that what life is? A long series of shapeless events ending in a figure in the sand that only two people can decipher? I saw what others didn't see, maybe because I never wanted to see what supposedly was there. Yoav didn't see anything. I only had to look into his eyes to know he didn't see what I did. All I had to do was listen to him breathe, and I knew that all those years behind the camera had blinded him to the scene of injustice that we finally saw there. Seeing is believing, said my grandmother, but to see is also to know what one wants to believe. Yoav thinks I believed it all. He doesn't want to realize that I understood the farce of it all. I felt the sadness of seeing that boy exploited by a white man who had convinced him to act out that pantomime for all of us, in exchange for God knows how many coins. Seeing is understanding what's at stake. I saw what others didn't, maybe because they, in their selfishness, sought in that scene the reality they wanted. All of them, even Yoav, wanted to find a salvation that didn't exist, and they couldn't comprehend that in its place was a story of disenchantment and violence. They saw the boy, and behind him they saw nothing. They didn't see the long line of children, past and future, Black, indigenous, mixed, who were trying to survive in a world that expelled them from the start. They were searching for the end of the world, but didn't know how to see it when it was right in front of them. I saw what the others didn't, and I knew I couldn't leave, that my story was there, and that time had ended up separating Yoav and me, those two youngsters who broke with social expectations and crossed an invisible border. Everyone sees what they want to see, said my grandmother. I saw the scorched earth of my great-grandfather Sherman, and in it I saw a reflection I'll never forget. The lands that would be razed years later by Ephraim Rios Mont's armies. I saw a child lost in a cyclone of history, acting out in a cruel historical play that obeyed no laws, not those of farce or of tragedy or of comedy. I saw what others didn't see, and I knew immediately that Yoav wouldn't understand, precisely because only two people could, she and I, my daughter and I. I saw, and I knew right away that my daughter would also see, even if years had to pass before she did. One day, she would think back and she'd understand what I saw, the long chain of injustices that ended in mockery at the edge of the world, leaving a wake of disenchantment behind. I knew someday she would understand that behind that child, there were many others. I knew she would understand my faithfulness to that vision, even if it was already too late, and that someday she would take it as her own. I felt an enormous joy at the realization, the joy of knowing that something would forever unite us, a secret language that only she and I would speak, from which her father had unfortunately been exiled. I knew that someday she would see the drawing in the wet sand of history, and, comprehending it, she would forgive me. That day, I believe, is today. And I repeat, I wish I could have written this letter in a secret language, in the secret language written by the tides and understood only by the pariahs of history. She and I, my daughter and I, you and I. So, hopefully that is a little intriguing. I know that those are little capsules within a much larger story, but I think you can get a little idea of the tone of the book and also certain of the kind of recurring ideas that we'll hopefully get to in this conversation. So, Carlos, I don't know if you want me to start by asking you a question?
Sounds good, yeah.
Okay, so where to begin? I guess I wanted to talk, so this character who we've just read starts out as a model and becomes a conceptual artist. And that is, it's a long trip from point A to point B. But what she does, her conceptual art kind of consists of interventions in the mass media, and she does a kind of fake news that ends up changing affecting the stock market and this kind of thing. So, and you draw on a lot of cases where art has gone before judgment, like the Francis Alice's The Rumor, the Escari, Jacobi, and Costa's Happening for a Dead War, Whistler versus Brancusi, et cetera, et cetera. and the idea that she keeps coming back to is that all art leads to judgment, and there is no art without judgment. So I guess I just wanted you to talk a little about your interest in art in general, and what led you down this rabbit hole of art and judgment.
Yeah. So I'll begin talking a little bit about like the origin of like, you know, the connection I make between like fashion and art, right? So back in like, I believe it was 2011, I went with my wife to this exhibit in the Met in New York. There was an exhibit from a recently like deceased back then like fashion designer Alexander McQueen. And my wife really wanted me to go, and I was confused. Or like, you know, I didn't think that I was interested in fashion. I didn't know who Alexander McQueen was, and I was expecting like some sort of like frivolity or like something completely different from what I found. But rather, when I entered, it was like this fascinating exhibition where where you could like see that McQueen was trying to think what was the relationship between like, you know, clothes, fashion, animality and humanity, right? So there was something there that got me like to start thinking, right, of like fashion and clothing as something more than just kind of like, you know, how we typically think of it as like technology. And that drove me like from fashion to the arts. But in the peculiar case that you mentioned, right, this is the case of Virginia McAllister that begins as a model and ends up in doing this sort of conceptual art. And there, the kind of like foundation or the origin was the works of like these three Argentine conceptual artists that you mentioned, Jacobi, Escari, and Costa, who were already back in the 1960s, early 1970s, were beginning to think about like what we call today post-truth. So beyond like the time that like Trump arrived and then fake news became like a big thing, they were already kind of like beginning to understand that like in our contemporary kind of mediatic society, you know, truth is about the construction of belief. So if you're able to like trick, you know, the media into feeling that like, you know, what you're saying is truth, then that will be disseminated and circulated as truth. So what they did was like quite interesting. They like, they back in the day in the 1967, in order to like showcase this belief, they convinced the media, they gave the media some documents that like hypothetically showed that they had staged a happening or like an event that had never happened. And the media believed it, and they published it as if it had been true, right? Like, so like typical post-truth scenario. So I was fascinated back in the day 5 years ago by this sort of like, you know, artistic intervention. And I began to think of an artist like Virginia McAllister that could take that to the extreme. At the same time, back then, there were a couple of trials involving like Latin American writers. So I don't know if you remember Megan, but it was when the Maria Kodama, the widow of Luis Borges, was suing everybody for plagiarism, right? So it was Pablo Kachatkan had been like sued and brought to trial by cases of plagiarism by the Luis Borges state, and also I think Agustin Fernandez Mayo, the Spanish writer. And I remember reading back then about that trial and being kind of fascinated by it when I was reading that like the defense of Kachatkan had brought as a witness Cesar Aira, for example. I was like, something interesting is happening here when like, you know, the key witness for the defense is, you know, an artist who is trying to showcase that art has like an autonomy to do something that, and it's not like binded by like, you know, or basically trying to define what are the limits of art and where does like the law begin, right? I think like art in one way or another always has to, you know, reach that point in which it defines like its limits and you know what is beyond it, right? So in one way or another, the novel, and particularly through the character of Virginia McAllister, stages what could be, you know, that limit, and what are the limits of art, and what lies beyond it, be it politics, being history, being ethics, or something like that, right? And I guess the other thing, like the other key topic of the novel would be, you know, camouflage, as you say, mimicry, and this sort of like world of like copies and differences that, like, you know, it's very contemporary to us. We do retweets, and when we do a retweet, it's the same copy but a little bit different, like displays, right? And this leads me a little bit to the question I had for you to begin with, which is something that we have talked about recently a little bit. The fact that translation works a little bit like this. Translation works a little bit like, you know, like a chameleon. It's like, it's a copy, but it's different. It's its own thing. And we could perhaps even begin to think of translation under these terms that like the novel already kind of brings into play.
Yeah, I really like that idea. And, you know, I translated the whole book and never really thought about that, how, you know, my intervention in the book has a lot to do, or is very similar to some of the interventions that are actually in the book. And, you know, when you talk about translation as camouflage or mimicry, the first thing I thought of, which I don't think is how you meant it, was what we talked about before, how, you know, you think about camouflage as hiding, but it also has this, this aspect of protecting you, right? So, you know, I think being a translator does have that kind of aspect where you're kind of involved in the book, but you never make yourself as vulnerable as the author themselves. And that was kind of the first thing I thought about. And another thing was when you talk about translation as a copy, you know, it happens so often that we talk about a copy as something inferior and something like a cheapened version, which I think translation suffers from a lot. I would say unfairly. I think that, I don't know, you know, sometimes I you should never do this, but every once in a while I go on like Goodreads and look at what people are saying about the book, about not just this book, but all of my translations. And it happens so often that readers say, and this doesn't happen with actual critics, but readers will say, you know, this book was, it was so well written, or the language was so good. You know, I can only imagine how good the original was. Just like with this inherent assumption that if the translation is good, oh my God, how good is the original, you know? So there's always this idea that it's a degradation. The copy is a degradation, the translation is a degradation. And I think that a lot of my work as a translator is in revolt against that, you know? And I can go once again into my theory of twinship here.
Oh yeah, that was great, yeah.
Because I always like to talk about that, because, you know, I'm a twin, and when you're a twin, you know, you grow up with people lumping you together and thinking you are like copies of each other and kind of the same person, and you go through life kind of trying to make yourself an individual, or like establish your identity and your individuality, but you're always doing it in direct relationship to someone. Like you're always kind of looking into an imperfect mirror. And I think that has affected my approach to translation. I always think of my books as having to, you know, differentiate themselves and stand on their own as unique wholes and work within themselves, and not like free of comparison with the original. I don't know.
Yeah, and what you're saying completely like ties in with what we were doing, because in this particular case, you know very well that, like, you know, I think we both have this idea that like writing is an ongoing process that only gets like kind of interrupted by publication, but like if we had time, we would continue working on stuff. So as you know very well, like when the possibility of the translation happened, I immediately told you, let's continue editing, let's continue rewriting, let's continue and we did major changes, right? So
Yeah.
from even the title, right, which would be the most obvious thing, in Spanish it would be literally, it was Museo Animal, which would literally translate into Animal Museum, and this is natural history, right? So there you get one of the kind of hints. The Spanish version has 425 pages. This has less, but it's a different font. But anyways, we worked a lot, and so definitely the idea that the original would be much better. In this case, I don't. Hopefully, and I trust wouldn't work quite perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, I would never make the claim that my translations are better than the original, but I think it's a mistake to just assume that all translations are worse copies. And then you get to the question, what's even the point of comparing them? Why are we, is that an interesting question? Is it a good question to ask? Which one is better? I mean, I think we should just accept them both and trust the writer and trust the translator, and both works of art are going to be imperfect and flawed. But
and when I was, one of the things that I think we have also talked about previously was when I was writing Museo Animal Natural History, I kind of felt in a way closer to your work as a translator, because how the novel is structured is such that taking to the limit this idea of camouflage, mimicry, imitation, and copying. I decided that one of the great tenets of usual traditional writing is the writer must adopt a voice of his or her own, right? And I wanted to perhaps play with that. I remember 5 years or perhaps no more, 10 years ago, I read this fascinating novel by Guillermo Cabrera Infante, the great Cuban writer, the novel Tres Tices Tigres, which I think got translated as Three Trapped Tigers. Hard title to translate. And there, Cabrera Infante, who is a magician of language, he devotes 50 or 60 pages in which he tells the same story from kind of the styles of 10 or 7 of the great writers of the Cuban tradition. And I remember reading it back then and saying, well, this is interesting. It's the Cabrera Infante voice or style comes through even when he's kind of working through other voices, right? That's sort of pastiche or something. And when I was working with natural history, I was telling myself, well, this is going to be a long novel. And I might even bore myself if I just write it in the same style. One of the possible ways of being playful about it would be to do it 5 sections, each section with the style or vaguely imitating the style of an author I admire. And in the same way that a chameleon or a mantis prey gets its identity by its surrounding, while at the same time being a completely independent, being, right? So that somehow I felt in that sense how you must feel as a translator, because something I usually think about, particularly when I read recently a beautiful article that Lily Meyer published about your work as a translator, in which she asks a crucial question. So she says basically, Megan McDowell has translated very different authors. Samantha Schweblin, Alejandro Zambra, Maria Enriquez, Diego Zúñiga, Lina Meruane. How does, in a way, the translator is able to construct an identity or a style within those kind of very disparate voices that he or she has to adopt, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of style or identity. It would be hard for me to point to something and say that's my style. Really all I could do is say that this is my reading style, because all the writers who I translate are writers who I love and who in the same way that a reader, you read a book and you love it and you engage with it and you start to feel a certain sense of ownership of that book, that's the kind of feeling I have with the books that I translate. In terms of injecting a style, like I definitely have an approach, and this, like I have a very editorial approach, and I question everything, and I always do that. But it's kind of more, it has to do more with my approach than any kind of style that I could point to in the text. What I do think, with that article by Lily Meyer, I think what is really interesting to think about is how she is all for remembering that translators have egos, personal histories, and subjectivities, and there's no way to avoid injecting those into your text. And I think that a translator does have to be pretty sensitive. You have to always be sensing what the text calls for and what it means. And more than just like a transfer of language. That's, I think, what my approach is. But it's much easier for me to talk about approach than it is about actual style.
I think it's always
but I can definitely say that. Say what?
That it's always hard to talk about like one's own style, right? It's like,
it's
visible for everybody else, but it's invisible almost for the person that is doing it, right?
Right.
Like
but
right now,
everybody has certain resources available to them, and they're the only ones you have, so you don't even realize they're the ones you're turning to. I can definitely say that in your book and a couple others, I've definitely, the things that have come to mind as I'm translating have sometimes been very Southern terms of phrases. So, and I'm from the South, and my identity, I guess, it kind of creeps in that way. And in your book, I thought that was really, it made a lot of sense because the South is so important. Both the South, South America and the idea of the South and Sherman's march to the South and all that. So I kind of decided I'll go with it in this sense.
It does seem to be a book that like where the relationship between the North and the South seems to be at stake, right? Like you mentioned Sherman.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I became interested in Sherman beyond his like famous strategy of like, scorched earth was due to the fact that like almost poetically in a strange way, he's like, his military movements were called the March to the South, right? And I became interested in a way with how like, the countries of the North, be it Europe or be it, the United States, have like imagined or fantasized about what they might find in Latin America, right? And there's a great tradition leading all the way to natural historians like Alexander von Humboldt or even Darwin, where these European or Northern travelers would travel to Latin America trying to find their like paradise, right? Like, the typical like fountains of youth or this type of like enterprises. And in one way or another, what we find in natural history is the inversion of that kind of like paradigm. This family, which comes from the North, which comes from New York and Israel, travel through the Latin American jungle, finding almost the fountain of youth, but at the end, they don't find anything, right? They find kind of like political reality, they find, exploitation, they find child labor. And the question is how they interact with that. How do they, like each of them, the father, the mother, and even the daughter, right? Who eventually becomes the fashion designer that jumpstarts the narratives, reacts to them.
Yeah, I think the idea of this, this kind of search for revelation or transcendence, like, throughout the book, there's kind of this feeling that meaning or the thing that's going to tie everything all together is there, but it's just out of reach. And that trek through the jungle is kind of the image or the metaphor for that, but it's present throughout the book. And I guess I wanted to ask you, well, let's see if I can articulate a question this way. You mentioned that you're kind of channeling certain voices. I'm assuming these are Latin American voices.
Yeah, mostly.
So this made me think about, so there was a review that came out the other day, and it was a really good review. I think it was on 3 a.m. And the guy right in the beginning of the review had a line that was, two main conceptual threads seem to guide the text. The first is a reflection on the notion of identity, which has always fascinated Latin American writers. And I read lines like that because people ask me about Latin American literature. They say, you know, what's the future of Latin American literature? Or they ask me to make generalizations. And I always feel like I cannot do that because, you know, Latin America is so huge and so varied and so has so many groups and voices and even languages and accents that I cannot do that. And I'm jealous of this ability to say, the notion of identity has always fascinated Latin American writers. But I feel like you might have a different perspective on that as a Latin American writer. And this book does engage with questions of identity. But I have the feeling that you're trying to do something even bigger with this book, that you're trying to write like the great American novel.
Oh,
but, but as in, you know, all of America, North and South. And
you know, so like the only way that I can like kind of like answer this without seeming like, you know, presumptuous or like pretentious would be like, I think you're completely right. I think like the question of like Latin American identity is very hard to gauge, and particularly the question of like, what does it mean to write as a Latin American? Just because it's a huge region, each nationality has a completely different history. And you know, like, and to engage properly with each of those like histories, you know, usually ends up producing different texts, right? So to avoid generalities, it's very hard to like ask about the question of Latin American identity in general. But like, for example, I would say that in my peculiar case, just because of like my biographical kind of accident. So I was born in Costa Rica, raised in Puerto Rico, and moved to the United States. And then national identity was always kind of like almost something that produced me like anxiety. Like somebody, because in Puerto Rico, they consider me Costa Rican. In Costa Rica, they consider me Puerto Rican. And when I arrived to the States, that I remember when I was at the university the first year, somebody asked me, so like, you know, where are you from? And I don't remember what I said. I might have said Costa Rica. And they answered, so Puerto Rico, because they were mistaking the two, which kind of constantly happened. And I said, well, you know, correctly. And eventually became like, you know, a matter of debate. And then the person said, well, so you're Latin American. And I kind of discovered my Latin American identity that way. That it could be like a way in which, like, you know, I could, you know, also relate to, you know, this continental identity. And in one way or another, the novel does seem to be like a Latin Americanist kind of novel in one way or another. Something like, something which I encounter also with Bolaño, right? So Bolaño, also the same thing. Bolaño was born in Chile. Moved because of political reasons when he was like 16 or 17 to Mexico, returned, then went to Spain, and then in Chile, they originally they didn't want to like consider him a Chilean novelist. Now, of course, they do. You know, so poetic justice. So eventually, in one of the interviews, they ended up asking him, so, you know, what's your identity? And he's like, I'm just a writer who writes in Spanish, right? So like language being a common identity. And in one way or another, yeah, I do think that like the novel deals with questions of identity, but also to dismantle identity. We become sometimes obsessed with like, you know, here I am, and then there is the other person. But like the one thing that camouflage or like, you know, mimesis and all of these kind of interesting animal behaviors teach us is that like, you know, the I is always defined in relationship to the other, like the environment. And that there's in that relationship is where identity is like formed. And I think like politically, that's almost like a political gesture. We must understand that like we don't have like strong kind of separate identities that just like oppose us. Rather, we're always defining ourselves in relationship with other people. And it's only when we accept that we're able to kind of like, you know, construct a community, you know. So
Yeah.
that is one of the possible ways. And I think like in that sense, translation does provide us with a model for you know, a culturally sensitive politics, because there is an approach between two different cultures that kind of merge together within a
Yeah,
text.
it's an attempt at like genuine communication or genuine understanding and communication.
So that's why, like, for example, it's like very interesting for me to like sometimes like read your translations, like, since I can read English but I couldn't translate it clearly. When I read it, I'm like, okay, so like this is like, it's almost like also entering the culture from a different side, which
Yeah.
I really appreciate. So should we
That was
go?
a very good answer to a very unfocused question.
Nobody, it led to somewhere.
I think we have some questions from the audience. Carlos, are there any plans for an English translation of your essay collection?
Not right now, although we do have a couple of essays coming out. So there's one essay on art brut and the work of Enrique Villamatas, which is coming out in the Wide Review very soon, I think like this month or the next. And hopefully we'll be working on some of the other essays relatively soon, and even some reviews. So I love reviewing. I always produce good reviews because as an author, I feel like, you know, it's I'm very sensitive to negative reviews, and I also
You're
like
a good literary citizen.
Exactly. So I love reviewing, and the book includes like certain reviews also, like from like Samantha Schweblin, whose works I love, and like Megan has translated, and other like great Latin American authors that I would recommend, like Emiliano Monge, Marta Ponte Alsina, a Puerto Rican author whose work is like, I think the best Puerto Rican stuff out there, and I really love it. Luis Chavez, who I have also written about, a Costa Rican author that comes from the side of poetry, a little bit like Alejandro Zambra, another author that I clearly have followed since the very beginning. So hopefully soon we will be working on that.
Here's hoping. Here's another question. I am a student of Spanish, so always looking for reading in primary language, but I am intrigued by the process of translation. How did you come to that profession? What background? And for Carlos, how do you come to the point of trust in giving your work to a translator? Well, okay. Without going into too long of an answer, basically, I became interested in translation as a genre, first of all, and then I was very interested in Latin American literature, which at the time I read in English. I was always very interested in reading books that came from other languages, but I didn't know any other languages. So I decided to learn Spanish, and I moved to Chile, and I was about 24, 25 years old. And I lived here for 3 years, and then I learned some Spanish, and then I went back to the States and I got a master's degree at the University of Texas at Dallas, which all of their humanities program has a focus on translation, but I worked very closely with my mentor, Rainer Schulte, and the American Literary Translators Association. And through those organizations, I kind of got my start as a translator. Also, I forgot to mention that just after graduating school, undergraduate, I did a year-long internship at a publishing house called Dalkey Archive, which they focus on a lot on translation. So for me, there were some pieces that were really crucial. One was having this kind of institutional connection through Dalkey Archive, where I learned about publishing and translation, and then through the education programs at UT Dallas. But just as important, if not more, was actually going and living in Chile. I live in Chile now. You know, I live translation. It's like my lifestyle, I guess. And my writers are my friends. I go to book fairs, and you know, it's not an academic exercise for me. And I think those two sides of it have been really important for me. So I hope that's helpful.
And I guess regarding the question of trust, like I might as well tell like how we got to know each other, right? So I mentioned before like the work of Alejandro Zambra, right? One of the great Chilean writers right now. So I had read back, I think like 8 or 9 years ago, I had read Alejandro Zambra's work, and I had just began like, well, I'd finished the novel. And I was like interested in getting like parts of it translated because my wife doesn't read in English. So I wanted, you know, her to be able to read parts. And I said, well, you know, like I really love, like I had read Megan's translation of The Private Lives of Trees, La Vida Privada de los Árboles, and I had really loved it. And I said, back then it was good because I was naive enough to think that I could just write out of the blue to somebody. And I wrote to Megan, and without having published anything, Megan very kindly and generously accepted to like take on the project. But it all began, the trust I think was grounded upon her work as a translator, right? And like, you know, and ever since it has become obvious, right? So like whenever I read her new translations of Samantha Schweblin or Mariana Enriquez or Diego Zúñiga or Lina Meruane, an author who I love and has like a very hard kind of style to follow, I say like, if Megan can translate Lina, then Megan can definitely translate, you know, Museo Animal or Natural History, right? So that sort of kind of builds a trust. And by now we know each other, we know how to work with each other very well. So that I guess like builds a trust and a friendship.
Yeah, I think that, you know, for Carlos to trust me with his novel is not as difficult as Carlos trusting a Japanese translator with his novel. I'm assuming you don't know Japanese, Carlos. Because, you know, we do work very closely. He can read in English. I ask him questions when I don't understand something. We talk about like what's best for the text. You know, it's very much like a give and take. Like if he doesn't like something, he can tell me. If, you know, I want to make changes, I can tell him. He's very generous, and you know, he always gives me the final say on the text in English. But you know, he's not really just blindly shutting his eyes and letting me do it. He's very, very involved in the process.
And I think we have 2 more questions. So one of them was about like, ¿Cómo se llama el libro en español? What's the title of the book in Spanish? And it's Museo Animal. It was published by Anagrama in 2017. So as I mentioned before, it would be Animal Museum in English if it had been literally translated, but we both decided alongside like Julia Ringo, the editor, to change it to Natural History. Which I think works much better with like, you know, what the novel is about. Then I think we have another question which says, what books have you both enjoyed recently?
I can go first.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, there's a pretty short answer to that because the most of my reading goes towards my translation work. So, you know, I'm working on 2 big projects now, which I'm going to mention because hopefully readers will start looking forward to them because they're going to be great. One of them is by Alejandro Zambra, a book called Chilean Poet, which is his longest novel and I think his best novel. It's really funny and timely and beautiful. And the other one is by Mariana Enriquez, another writer who I work with a lot regularly, who also wrote a giant book called Our Share of Night. And it's kind of a fantasy type of novel, but very grounded in Argentine and, you know, Brazilian, Paraguayan history, mythology. And it's a beautiful, really entertaining and literary fantasy novel. So that's taking up a lot of my time these days. But, you know, we are in quarantine, so I am reading for fun. I've just been looking at my bookshelf and finding books that I haven't read. And I'm about to finish today a book called Out Stealing Horses, which is a book I've had around for forever, and it won a bunch of awards when it came out. It's a Norwegian novel by Per Petterson, translated by Anne Bourne. And it is truly beautiful. It's, you know, it takes place in the kind of rural Norwegian countryside, and it's a masterpiece in terms of pacing. Like, you start out reading this book and you think you know what you're getting into, and then it very quietly just shifts into all these different things. So that's what I'm reading right now. What about you?
Well, so I guess like I want to recommend like one of the most beautiful novels that I have read in the past couple of years, which is Alia Trabuco Serran's The Remainder, right?
Yeah.
La Resta in Spanish, The Remainder in English was translated into English by Coffee House Press in the US.
Sophie Hughes, translator.
Yeah, Sophie Hughes, translator. And that's an extremely beautiful book, basically like a sort of rewriting of Asile Dine in the Chilean context, political context of also the question of like, what does it mean to like, you know, be handed down a legacy, a political legacy in this case. I read also during the quarantine, I read Cheever's journals, were beautiful. I had heard a lot about them, and they were quite impressive. I read a novel that like is coming out in November, I believe, by Mauro Javier Cárdenas, Aphasia, which I loved. It kind of like takes on the Thomas Bernhard sort of like tradition of like monologues, but very beautifully like tries to like deal with like a character that is trying to avoid thinking about the sad situation that his sister is in, and does this through language. So those would be three of the books that I have been recently reading. And one Croatian book that I recently read and was superb was Dasa Drinčic's Egg, and another novel of hers called Belladonna. I think both published by New Directions. And it's an author who died, I think, like 2 years ago, and she's able to deal with kind of like the political history of Europe from a Croatian perspective, but just the language is astonishing. Reminds me of another Croatian writer, Dubravka Ugrešić, also The Museum of Unconditional Surrender. Beautiful, beautiful books. So those would be my suggestions. And just we have one final question, or two final questions, which I'll do.
We got two final ones, and they're tough ones for you.
So this one is, how do you conceptualize your identity as a writer artist in terms of the forms, writing, photography? Is there also an identity there? Yeah, you know, like I think as an artist, you like basically the only way that you can define your identity is through the medium itself, right? So you define yourself as a writer in relationship to language. And it's always in that relationship where in a way where I feel that I'm being the most truthful and honest, right? Beyond it all, like I'm a little bit like in day to day, I'm a little bit cynical. I make the jokes, but at the moment of writing, that's where like true belief comes in.
No.
And that would be my kind of my answer to that question. And then the other, I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit fast, but I think we're running out of time. So this may be tough, but I'm an artist very interested in natural history, specifically in terms of the relationship. I lost the question, 1 second.
To the scientific method, the 19th century impulse to categorize the world in the belief that truth is ultimately accessible. Categorization equals visibility, and an exhaustive catalog makes visible the importance of what is invisible, left out. Does any of that resonate with the role of natural history in your novel? I think the short answer to that question is yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think
no, I mean, that touches on a lot of things that I actually wanted to ask you about, like the archive and those kinds of things.
Collection.
I'll just let you answer. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think like, you know, like at the end of the day, I'm coming from an author that was like highly influential for me was W.G. Sebald, and W.G. Sebald basically takes the novel, he like takes it to the kind of natural history cabinets of curiosities as they would emerge in like, you know, the Renaissance period leading to the 19th century, and thinks of the novel as kind of like an empty recipient or Russian doll where you could like put all of your like fascinations. And in one way or another, I think about my novels, as Megan mentioned, as archives where like you can like kind of like classify or categorize kind of your fascinations or obsession in a cabinet or a collection, right? Yeah, so definitely I think that's where I'm guided, and that's why I think the title like really works, because it suggests that like I'm thinking of natural history as a way of like thinking about, you know, how to like think about questions of truth, how to believe, how to think of the birth of science, and like also like how to question those categories.
I feel like we could keep going and keep going, but I think we have reached our time limits. So until a Powell's person comes on, I'm just gonna say thank you.
Thanks so much
for this time and for staying up until very early in the morning.
Oh, thank you, Megan, and thanks to Powell.
And thanks to Powell.
Thank you to both of you for joining us, and to the audience for the fantastic questions. It was a really great event and a superb conversation. So we're so honored that we were able to host Megan and Carlos. You can head over to the chat button on your computer right now. If you click on that, you'll see that I shared a link to Natural History, which you could purchase on powells.com, as well as 2 of the books that they both mentioned that they currently or recently read. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and you can always keep up with our events on powells.com. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Have a good night. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.